So, hello everybody, my name is Adil. I'll be once again your moderator for this webinar today. Once again, I would like to thank you and all our participants for your interest in the CMBES webinar series. Our typical announcements, make sure that this webinar will be recorded and will be present on our YouTube channel. So please make sure to like and subscribe with the CMBES YouTube channel. And then also the fact that with CMBES, we always encourage groups and organizations and hospitals to consider a CMBES peer review that looks at the clinical engineering standards of practice that CMBES also publishes, and we actually have our 2023 version going to be released in a couple of months. So if you're interested, please do contact the CMBES Secretariat. So for today, this is a very special webinar series where we are actually celebrating women in STEM. So tomorrow, Wednesday, March the 8th, is the International Women's Day. In collaboration with our Women's in Engineering Working Group at CMBES, we thought, you know what, why not celebrate the entire month? Why restrict it only to one day? So what we're doing is that we're going to have a series of webinars, and you will hear from women who have impacted STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in different facets, through different facets. And it truly is through this diversity that we can recognize all of the work that women do and how important their contributions are, whether it being in STEM, socially, economically, culturally, or even politically. So join me, CMBES, IFMBE, with our first talk for this month. And just before I hand it over to Marianne, I just wanted to some logistics. Once again, it's going to be typed questions that we'll be utilizing in our chat and Q&A functionality. All the questions will be answered at the end of the presentation, but you are welcome to ask any questions during. And I will ask Michael if you can introduce our topic for today.
Yes, quite gladly. We have a wonderful speaker today. And I think, as Adil mentioned, we wanted to celebrate that we in clinical engineering were part of a much larger engineering family right across the country. And so we wanted to really celebrate in that perspective and also really give some real credence to the fact that I think over the last couple of years with COVID, we have lots of new people, or with, the awful discoveries from the last few years. I think we all can recognize that we don't know our own country, and maybe we need to know how we can be engineers and be better in our own country, as well as in various fields and work with different people. So with that in mind, we have a lovely speaker today, Jessica, and then Marie-Ange is going to do the full introduction for her. But a really quick précis of her webinar, which is entitled "Learning to Walk in a Good Way." It's Canada has a lot of freedoms and is founded on democracy, but it's important to look through back through our own history at its present through a diverse lens. So when we look at Canada and we see the truth, there were unfortunately oppressive actions towards First Nations and M.Sc people and Inuit, gender discrimination, and inequity towards females, as well as systematic privilege that leaves out other equity deserving groups like BIPOC, LGBTQ2S+, as well as newcomers. We're a burgeoning country, and I think we all recognize that, and it's a wonderful thing. So growing up in Canada, it took a while for Jessica to see the many layers of systems that support certain prejudices and stereotypes. And as the world advocates for movements such as UNDRIP and women's suffrage, change is coming at the hands of those of us with lived experience, for instance, Jessica. So this webinar, she'll share her lived experience and how she's learned to navigate through cisgender, white, male-dominated engineering profession and be a cycle breaker, a dream weaver, and a change maker. So we very much welcome Jessica with us today. And I think to introduce, I'll turn it over to Marie-Ange.
Thank you, Michael. So Jessica Vandenberghe is a professional engineer and has a master's in science, is born of the Dene Thá First Nation, and she's a 60s scoop survivor and raised in an inclusive German farming family in northern Alberta. And her exceptional career is based on 2 engineering degrees from the University of Alberta. And she has worked in the oil sands, mining, regulatory infrastructure, consulting industries, and academia. She's part of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering as the industrial chair in Indigenous Engineering. She's a mother of 2 and at the intersection of 2 equity-deserving groups in the engineering profession, which drives her passion for equity, diversity, and inclusion, and comes with lived experience to move ahead truth and reconciliation to build strong, healthy relationships with Indigenous communities. She believes in healing ethical behavior and will bring that to the department as she works towards integrating Indigenous ways, decolonization, and building the necessary programs to support First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students, staff, and faculty to ensure their success. I'm handing it over to you, Jessica. A very impressive CV.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining. If my audio isn't loud enough, feel free to just pop in the chat and I can switch to headphones. I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to spend the next little while.
How are you?
Sorry, can I hear somebody there?
No, I spent like 15 minutes talking about it.
Adele, can you mute?
Adele, you might want to mute.
All right, thank you.
My apologies.
All right, so hopefully you can see my screen here. So I'm going to chat a little bit with you folks about my lived experience. And I'd like to just open with a land acknowledgement. So I'm joining you today from the Traditional Territory Treaty 6, Métis Nation Zone number 4, here in Amiskwaci, Waskahagan, known as Edmonton, Alberta. And it's always important to take a bit of time every day to really think about the land that we stand on. Land spirit, water spirit, Mother Earth. She protects us, nourishes us, looks after us, has been here since time immemorial, and will be here long after humans are off this planet as well. She's someone, our relation that needs to be respected and really taken care of. And we just want to recognize always the First Nations, Métis, Inuit, whose hearts and footsteps have also crossed these lands for thousands of years and many generations, often acting as stewards towards the relationship with Mother Earth. So I encourage you to reflect on your own relationship with land spirit when your ancestors first stood foot on Turtle Island, and think about that. I'm born from 2 First Nations parents, and my ancestry goes back thousands and thousands of years within Turtle Island. So I encourage you to think about where your ancestors have come from as well. All right, so we're going to talk about a couple of things today, several things, but I always like to start with this graphic. When we have conversations about privilege and equity, diversity, inclusion, around reconciliation, everyone's at a different stage of their learning journey. And everyone is at a different stage of readiness for these conversations as well. And this really speaks to that. There are folks that are hanging out in that fear zone. There's people in the learning zone, people in the growth zone. People in the fear zone often come back with comments around these conversations like all lives matter, or white lives matter, or I don't think racism is an issue within the country, or comments like, well, why don't they just get over it? Folks in this zone aren't ready to open their ears to listen or open their eyes to see the truth. And so often we leave people in that zone alone. The learning zone, growth zone are really where you folks are. You're here today and ready to engage in this conversation. If you're in the learning zone, you know that there are things that aren't quite equitable within this country, that we've had a hard history. You might not know everything, but you're curious about it, but worried about offending, or how do you take the first step, or how do you face your own bias? And really that's where that zone is. And the growth zone, of course, are folks that are actively being allies or sharing their own lived experience if they're part of an equity deserving group as well, facing biases, continually learning and continually growing in this space. And so I just wanted to share that, to recognize that, again, the hard part sometimes about these virtual platforms is I can't see you. We are just getting to know each other in this virtual space. So I can't tell how people are reacting to the information. I also always want to be conscious of triggers because I don't know all your journeys. If there's content that is bothersome or triggers you from your own lived experience, please do seek out self-care, self-help from the support systems within your organizations, as well as available across Canada as well. There's a lot of support circles out there as well. All right, I also wanted to start with a bit of grounding in terminology, right? So a lot of the conversation today will be around reconciliation, equity, diversity, inclusion. I'll often use the acronym EDI, which stands for equity, diversity, inclusion. Diversity, from where, for the definition I'm using for this presentation, really talks about celebrating people's authenticity, multiple identities represented, usually within an organization, if we're talking about an organization or community or university or within our country. Inclusion is making comfortable, safe, and brave places where people can be their authentic selves. Thoughts, ideas, and perspectives of all individuals matter. Equity is different than equality, as everyone likely knows. But equity is really about finding policies, frameworks, cultures that fit multiple identities. So constantly and consistently recognizing and redistributing power. So knowing that power privilege is at play for some of the systems that we live in, education systems, enforcement systems, government systems, funding systems, things like that. And where we're trying to strive towards is when all of these are in harmony, they're recognized, we really build cultures, communities where people belong. At the heart of who we are, no matter where we came from in our lived experience, we all want to belong. We all want that feeling that we are seen for our true authentic selves, that we're comfortable being ourselves where we're at, and that we are valued. And I'd even go a step further to say that we're all loved as well. That is really what belonging is about. And so an organization that engages full potential of the individuals, where innovation thrives and views and beliefs and values are integrated. That's usually the definition that we use when we talk about organizational belonging. So I wanted to ground in that terminology as well. So when it comes to conversations about equity, diversity, inclusion, we have to recognize that there are many identities, right? So we know that a person is made up and they're a function of their genetics, so their biology. I am, again, what was said in my bio, a 60s survivor. So that means I was in the foster adoption system. I didn't grow up traditionally with my First Nations family in community. I grew up in a German farming family. So I grew up playing the accordion and going to Catholic church. But biologically, I come from two First Nations parents. I have a whole lot of First Nations ancestors that walk with me, but who I am genetically comes from that, even though I was raised in a very different environment. You're a function of your experiences, your lived experiences. Growing up in a small town, the closest town was 67 people. So my experience growing up was very different than someone who grew up in a thriving metropolis of over 1 million people. And so you're a function of your experiences. You're a function of your values and beliefs. I didn't grow up with elder teachings, knowledge keeper teachings. I grew up instead in a Catholic faith. So I grew up in a very different value belief system, but have come to learn and recognize natural law and the teachings that the elders have gifted me in order to come to a different place of values and belief. You're a product of how you're raised. So again, growing up on a farm, very different experience than colleagues who have grown up within the city. You're a product of your environment. I'm fortunate to have grown up within Canada, despite our oppressive history towards First Nations, Métis, Inuit. I do know that there's a lot of countries who have a very different environment, whose freedoms are less than ours. And of course, you're a product of what you surround yourself with. So your community and the people that you interact with, what you consume on social media, or what that you read. So you're a function of all of these things. And so each of us walks with different lived experience, different wisdom. And that comes to talking about identifiers. So identifiers are really how you define yourself in terms of different demographic categories. And so the ones in the middle of this wheel are ones that don't change. So I am the age that I am. I'm in my 40s. I have the physical ability that I have right now. That changes with environment, but you're born with certain physical ability. You're born with a certain gender. I was born female and identify as female. You're born of a certain race and ethnicity. So I was born as First Nations, but again, raised as German Catholic. You're born with a specific sexual orientation or identity as well. As you go around and live your life and gain your experience and gain your wisdom, the identifiers that are around the edge of this circle of this identity wheel have possibility of changing, or you're growing in those areas. So appearance, political ideology, pardon me, marital status. So I was married, now I'm divorced. Marital status can change with time. Job classification, religious beliefs can change, parental status, work background, creed, education, all of these things are different ways that we identify. And so for me, as we move cultures towards places of belonging, we need to make room for all of these different identities in which some of our frameworks and systems haven't always supported them. And so there is movements to practice indicators that these are safe places. So for example, you'll see in my Zoom name, my pronouns. I identify with the pronouns she, her. You'll hear when I introduce myself that I use my pronouns she, her to identify and to indicate to folks who perhaps are working through their sexual orientation, gender orientation, that I'm a safe place, that they can identify and feel comfortable identifying in whatever way they want. Land acknowledgements are also another indicator that we are a safe place. I'm a safe place for those on a different reconciliation journey, those perhaps who are a First Nations, Métis, Inuit blood and are looking for the identifying safe places in a place where systematic racism is very active. All right. When it comes to identifiers, I just wanted to shift into the next conversation a little bit around privilege and power. And this is always an uncomfortable conversation if this is your first exposure to these concepts and their existence within Canada. And so when we talk about demographics and the number of different identifiers in there, we need to recognize that a certain amount of power and authority has been built in our frameworks as a country. And so the middle of this wheel are the demographics of certain identifiers that have power built into the systems for them. On the outer edge of the circle here are the marginalized groups. And then you can see the categories around the outside here too. So for example, the one highlighted here is sex. So in the engineering profession, it's been male dominated for many years. Men typically experience privilege and power, authority above those of females who are marginalized within the category of sex. Same with gender. Cis men typically enjoyed the power in the engineering profession for a long time. Over that is cis women, over that of trans and non-binary as well. People starting to identify in that way. For Indigenous people as well, settlers, which we refer to folks that came to Turtle Island via boat. If you can trace back to about 1400 or later, typically we call those folks settlers versus First Nations, Métis, Inuit, who have been here since time immemorial for over 20,000 years. And so as Indigenous people, we are part of the marginalized group, settlers holding a lot of power and authority. And so I wanted to present this concept of privilege and power. And I wanted to play a video that will help with our learning in this as well. So can you just pop in the chat whether the sound is working? I think I clicked the clicky thing.
Yep, that's working.
Thank you. Oh, now it's thinking. try that.
Privilege is the unearned advantage we get from being part of a dominant group whose needs have traditionally been prioritized. We can experience privilege because of our gender, race, sexual orientation, ability, class, or other identities. Many of us experience a combination of privilege and disadvantages. For example, white women have privilege because of their race, but are at a disadvantage because of their gender. The privileges we have or don't have can have a big impact on our experiences at work. For example, people without disabilities can usually assume that the software their company uses will work for them. But people with disabilities often have to ask whether a tool is accessible, and if it isn't, they have to ask for an alternative. Or consider religious holidays. Employees who observe a dominant religion's holidays, like Christmas, can generally expect paid time off on those days. But employees who belong to more traditionally marginalized religious communities, such as Muslims, may have to use their vacation days to participate in holiday traditions. It's important to remember that privilege isn't something we earn or choose. Privilege is structural. It exists because our society as a whole prioritizes some groups over others. But while we can't control whether we have privilege, we can become more aware of it. That awareness is crucial. If we don't understand that privilege makes it easier for some people to succeed, we might think the more successful group is just working harder.
Here's an example. In corporate America, for every 100 men who are hired into manager-level positions, only 72 women are hired. This isn't because men are more qualified. Instead, it's largely because men benefit from unearned advantages in the hiring process. One study showed that replacing a woman's name with a man's name on the exact same resume increased the odds of being hired by more than 60%. Similar biases affect people of color, LGBTQ people, and people with other traditionally marginalized identities. In another study, replacing a stereotypically black-sounding name with a stereotypically white-sounding name on a candidate's resume resulted in 50% more callbacks, the equivalent of adding 8 years of work experience. And in the third study, when a candidate had something on their resume that suggested they were LGBTQ, such as belonging to an advocacy group, they received fewer callbacks. Remember, in all these studies, the candidates had the exact same qualifications. Privilege, not effort or ability, gave one group an advantage over another.
These examples show why it's so important to understand how privilege shapes our experiences. When we see why women, people of color, and others with traditionally marginalized identities are underrepresented, we can start to address some of the barriers that hold these groups back. But acknowledging our privilege can be really, really tough. It's uncomfortable to admit that we have an advantage we didn't necessarily earn, especially when we've still had to work hard. But when we do start to see the reality of our own privilege, we can also better understand the experiences of people with less privilege. And we can start to find ways to use our privilege to support and advocate for others. In other words, we can become allies.
All right, so I wanted to share that just to give us a more common understanding of privilege and what that means as well. But also what I want to emphasize from that video too is that it's not our fault, right? It's not your fault. It's not my fault that we live within these systems. They're systems that were built a long time ago that have evolved for hundreds of years to the place that we're at. And I also want to give the element of hope that these systems were built because of people, which means we can move them towards a more equitable place as people, right? So they're not impossible to dismantle. They're not impossible to change or to shift, right? So what I wanted to share with you are some surprising things in Canada. So feel free to open your chat and guess along here. But do you know when women earned the right to vote? We're celebrating International Women's Day tomorrow. Women, when Canada became a country in 1867, didn't always have the right to vote. They earned the right to vote after the work of the famous five, getting females recognized as people within this country. And that was in 1916, very close guess. Do you know when First Nations men earned the right to vote? And again, white European facing men could vote since 1867, women getting their chance to vote in 1916. First Nations men earned the right to vote in 1920. When did First Nations women earn a chance to vote? And so again, I didn't talk about the concept of intersectionality, but intersectionality is the divergence of multiple demographics that perhaps are marginalized. And so I'm an example of that. So as a female in the engineering profession, I've been in the minority for a long time. As a First Nations person in the engineering profession, I've been in the minority for a long time. But that intersection of female Indigenous adds extra layers of difficulty and barriers. So when did First Nations women earn a chance to vote? 1960, almost 100 years after Canada was country. When did, I'm from the West here, I'm not sure where we're all joining from today, but when did Calgary's Petroleum Club allow women to gain membership? And this one I always use as an example because in the engineering profession, just to show that there has been gender discrimination over the years, they didn't allow women to gain membership until 1989. When were gay rights written into Canadian law? And so we know LGBTQ2S+, the community has been working very hard to be recognized as well for different gender types and sexual orientations. Rights were written into Canadian law in 1992. When did expecting mothers gain equality with regards to EI? So this one is always interesting. I always find this one surprising too, that prior to this date, men would go on EI and get X amount of dollars. If you were a mother going off on EI because you had a child, you would get half of X going on to EI until this date. And this was 1993. And then when did the last residential school close? I know we haven't dived too much into Canada's oppressive history with respect to First Nations, Métis, Inuit, but the last residential school closed, 1997. A lot of places quote 1996, but it's actually 1997. And I know we don't talk too much in the public at this point yet about the Métis journey, but the Métis journey, they lived in road allowance settlements. There were still road allowance settlements up until about 2004, 2005. So there are still Indigenous people within this country who have that active lived experience, having been through residential schools. I'm born to two residential school survivor parents. Both spent more than 10 years in the school in their community. And it took its toll. Intergenerational trauma is something a lot of us still walk with for many, many reasons. So I did want to dive a little bit into the reconciliation history. So as First Nations, Métis, Inuit people, we talk about Turtle Island. And this picture really shows why we do that. North America does look like a turtle. There's a lot of creation stories when we talk about when First Nations came time immemorial to Turtle Island, talking about Sky Woman and diving into the ocean and the turtle offering his back to build a place for her, earth being brought up by the sea animals and birds bringing seeds and trees and making this beautiful place where we live. But the important thing I want you to note on the map is that nations moved freely amongst Turtle Island, freely traded for thousands and thousands of years, probably about 20,000 years or more before European settlers came to this country in about 1400, 1500. And what you want to note is that there are no borders. So your Indigenous way of thinking was to treat land spirit as a relation. And so because it's a relation, like you would treat a revered grandmother or an auntie, you can't own a relation, right? And you shouldn't exploit your relation. You shouldn't excavate it. you shouldn't trade it or barter it. And so Indigenous people roamed freely, took what they needed from the land, left the rest, acted in very respectful ceremony towards land spirit. But again, you can't own it, so no borders. So European ways developed in a way where land was reduced to a commodity that you could trade, something you could own, something you could barter, something you could excavate and exploit and strip resources from and be left alone. And so very different approaches to land. So this is the way when we talk about integration of Indigenous ways, or often known as indigenization, we talk about how do you bring back and walk together with two different worldviews. It's going back to the natural law teachings that we have from our elders and knowledge keepers. So as Canada, as settlers came to Turtle Island, 1500s onwards, there were a lot of wars and skirmishes between the English and the French and the Spanish, between Indigenous peoples. Slavery took up because of the documents like the Doctrine of Discovery, the Royal Proclamation. Systems were put in place in order to take the land, take the resources, treat Indigenous people like commodities as well. Taking people as slaves, taking them across country, looking really to conquer the lands and eliminate Indigenous people. When Canada became a country, 1867, our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, is quoted as saying that he wanted to kill the Indian in the child. And so when we talk about cultural genocide, it's recognizing the fact that our founding fathers had intentional efforts in order to eliminate culture amongst Indigenous people, converts to what they defined as civilized, not what we defined as civilized, and work towards elimination of what they quote unquote said the Indian problem. So shortly after Canada became a country in 1867, the Indian Act was put into effect around 1889, somewhere around that. So within a few years of Canada becoming a country. And the Indian Act is still in effect today. This is one of the world's most oppressive pieces of legislation. Hitler has been known to study this when he informed what the things that he did in Germany with the Holocaust and everything that he did over there, looking at this piece of legislation. And so the Indian Act does many things, and this graphic goes through some of them. Some of them talks about gender discrimination. Residential schools came out of this piece of act. Reserves were created, renaming of everybody to European names, enforced enfranchisement for any First Nations that went to university, restriction of movement, power to Indian agents, not being able to form political organizations or get legal representation, prohibition of alcohol. You couldn't use your language. You can practice religion ceremonies or wear cultural clothing. Cultural ceremonies were made illegal. Denial of voting rights. We just talked about that. Creating a permit system. All sorts of things in there. And this is just a few of the things taken out of the Indian Act, or that were in the Indian Act and noted here. And so for me as a First Nations engineer, if I had lived 100 years ago, I would have lost all my rights, number one, for going to university. I would have lost all my rights for marrying a non-Indigenous person. And I would have lost all those rights, not just for myself, but also for all my children and all my future generations because of the gender discrimination. So what I wanted to share is that this piece of oppression, this legislation, this oppressive legislation is still in effect today. And it's still active, and it's still seen in our systems that were developed since Canada became a country. Right, I wanted to play another video for you. Hopefully this sound works as well.
I was 6 years old when they took me to a residential school. I remember I was 6 years old when they took me to a residential school. I remember the day walking toward that school with my mother, and it was a silent walk, and I was so afraid. 20 or 30 little kids herded into the showers, and then your body being painted in white liquid of some kind, your hair cropped and then doused in kerosene. And that was pretty traumatizing. The school held roughly 220 people, half boys, half girls, and we were segregated. If I was caught waving at my sister, there'd be a punishment for it. And so as a result of that segregation, I never really learned any social skills that young people should be learning as they grow up. From a religious and spiritual perspective, of course, the churches lobbied hard to convert Indigenous people, Aboriginal people. They said that we were heathen and pagan. They targeted language in those things we had learned through all of millennia to know where we came from, to know who we were, as something that had to be eliminated. Before that time, I lived in a place called Guayastums. They call it Guilford Island now. We harvested from the forest all of the animals that we needed to provide us sustenance. And from the ocean in front of us as well, all of the species of whales and mink and fish. And I had a connection to the environment around us. And so after having spent years in those schools, by the time we were ready to leave, most of us were pretty broken. Many of us, including myself, descended into addictions, alcoholism, and violence, and it was pretty difficult. Those schools lasted for over 100 years. There was a history on this land that had been absolutely ignored. Nobody knew about the residential school legacy. Nobody knew about the intent of the Indian Act, the chronic challenges now facing Aboriginals. And we're starting to accept the idea that we have this shared history for which we all are responsible for. Murray Sinclair, the chair of the commission, denounced Canada. He had just recited a litany of intensive harms against Aboriginal people. And when he said, Canada, you have committed cultural genocide, there was just a silence in that room, and then all of a sudden it erupted in euphoria. We said survivors want an apology from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. And I was there and I heard the words, I'm sorry. And then I couldn't see because my eyes were just flowing with tears. I was so happy that somebody had said, I'm sorry. Canada, by the way, is the only Western country that has had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we're trying to look through a new lens. We and Canadians, we as an Aboriginal, we celebrate each other, everybody cheering each other up for equal, prosperous future for all of us. My name is Chief Robert Joseph, and I believe that Truth and Reconciliation is Canada.
All right, so I wanted to share that so you heard some additional first-hand lived experience about what that was like. So let me advance the slides here. Sorry, I do have a note that my internet is unstable, so it's not participating in my videos here. Just let me convert this and shift this over. But I wanted to share again is that we're all in a different spot for our reconciliation journeys as well. And that we have a long ways to go within this country. We are still first starting to wake up what it means to be First Nations, Métis, Inuit in this country. And we are not the only ones that were affected by the colonization. Settlers, newcomers, a lot of people that I talk to say that they haven't learned this information either. They didn't learn about residential schools. They didn't learn that Canada had slavery for since the 1400s till about the 1800s. That First Nations population went from about 150 million down to about, I think we're sitting now around 5 million. Population went from 100% First Nations down to about 5% in this country. The effect of disease and elimination of population because of new diseases introduced. Canada had 139 registered residential schools across this country, but there were also Indian hospitals, segregated medical systems. There was also day schools operated similar to residential schools. There are about 700 day schools that operated within this country as well. We know that with the recoveries of the bodies that have been happening, the children's bodies happening across the country, that over 150,000 children never came home. There's a lot that passed away from exposure, trying to get back to their home communities, a lot that were abused to the point of death. We know there was nutritional testing, medical testing, especially during the war on the children in these schools, in order to develop the weapons that were used during the war, as well as the nutritional testing was used to develop the Canada Food Guide. Things like this are the reality and the oppressive history that all of us have not been exposed to. But we need to, again, face those truths within this country in order to move forward with reconciliation. I myself was born in an Indian hospital here in Edmonton. It's called the Camsdale Hospital. It's no longer in operation. The Indian hospitals, folks were sent down typically from northern Canada to places like Edmonton's Indian Hospital. The treatment in those hospitals were similar to that of residential schools, a lot of unmarked graves around that site. That hospital that I was born in is now closed because of, because it should be. A developer has bought it and is looking to develop it into condos, which is quite controversial here in Edmonton, of course, because of the treatment and the things that went on within that hospital. So there's still a long ways to go within this country. I mentioned road allowance communities as well from the Métis side of things. And of course, the Inuit story is very different as well. Both the Métis and the Inuit didn't have active oppressive legislation like the Indian Act, but they did have other tactics that were taken to eliminate and oppress those two cultural groups as well. And the 60s scoop. So as mentioned in my bio, I'm a 60s scoop survivor. In the foster adoption system, kids were scooped up and put into European families, often geographically very far from their home communities. Kids were sold. Newspaper ads were placed in papers around the world, and 60 scoop survivors are now coming together, having found each other, and are starting to find their families and start cultural restoration from that side of things too. So a lot in our history that hasn't been talked about. So a little bit just more about myself. So again, I was born here in Edmonton. This is Alberta, of course, Edmonton in the middle here. I was adopted. My family at the time was in Calgary. My home nation is here, Dene Thá First Nation. So a significant distance from my home community. We later moved to Grand Prairie. I grew up on a couple of farms here and went to high school in Spirit River, and went to the Grand Prairie Regional College for a transfer program, and then came to Edmonton to the University of Alberta, where I did my 2 engineering degrees. But my lived experience when we talk about equity, diversity, inclusion, I've been through a lot of life changes, as everybody has been. So I've moved around, I've started new schools. Coming to university was moving from a small town to a very large city, living on my own. I defended my master's thesis, got married, started a new job all within a month, which is a little crazy. I'm blessed to have 2 children, a boy and a girl. I had 2 children, had to work a job. I was working through adoption issues at the time as well, leading my birth family. And then I'm now at the age where I have passing parents and aging aunties and uncles and things to deal with in terms of inheritance and all those difficult conversations. My mom also had a stroke, which disabled her, different way of life we needed to figure out. I have been divorced. It's probably the nicest divorce in the world, but still a life change that we needed to all adjust to. I had chronic pain for a while, hip surgery, and another job move in there as well. But as an Indigenous person, there's additional bundles that we carry that aren't always visible. So there's something called epigenetics, which is prenatal transfer, fear of life or fear of death. So when my mother was carrying me, because of the intergenerational trauma, things that were happening in her when she was carrying me, those fears have been passed on to me. And so part of the therapy work that I do is to sort out what's hers and what's mine, and try to heal all that. I grew up in rural Alberta, which wasn't always a safe place for a First Nation person. I was one of very few First Nation kids in my school. The one school, I was the only one. And although I wasn't actively beaten up or bullied in that way, it was exclusion that you can't explain as a kid. And I remember going home wanting to rub and wash the brown off my skin so I could look like everybody else. I didn't understand why no one played with me. I didn't understand why I wasn't invited to things or why I was picked on or always had to be the brown girl in the ring for that activity in kindergarten. It led to violent thoughts of suicide, some self-destructive phase of my life because I didn't understand it. I also had childhood trauma, a number of different abuses that happened that I didn't understand either, but had to deal with. There are places here in the city that I live in where if I walk, I'm automatically mistaken for a hooker. I've had people try to get me into their cars and to their houses. Murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls is active and alive within this country. I have an aunt who's been missing for about 4 years now in East Vancouver. I worry for my daughter, who is very First Nations facing, and what her life will be like. I did take up a profession where things weren't always right either. Equity, diversity, inclusion has come a long way, but when I was a junior engineer in the field, we did things like eat our lunches in trailers plastered in pornography. I had to drive drunken coworkers to the hookers and to the strip joints and things like that. There were places where I didn't feel safe, but you had to learn how to be invisible or blend in order to keep yourself safe. Equity, diversity, inclusion has come a long ways, but there's still a lot of harm and violence being done, harassment being done that needs to be recognized and seen for what it is. One of the largest traumatic experiences that I've had as an adult was being asked to leave a hospital while having a miscarriage. And although nobody will come right out and say that was racism, a doctor will never admit to that, it still wasn't right. I didn't have access to medical care. And if it wasn't for nurses helping me through that and hiding me away and putting me on IV, I don't know what would have happened. So these things happen. Racism exists in our medical systems, education systems, funding systems. And it is a reality that we need to see in order to move to a place of reconciliation, a place of equity. And it's really where we're building allyship and helping folks see the truth, knowing that it's not your fault and it's not my fault for the systems that we live in, but we have a responsibility to see the truth and make change where we can. The other teachings that get me through all of this, I have really wonderful support systems that help keep me balanced and healthy and help me work through things that happened to me when I was a kid. But they have taught me the importance of humility, acting in service of others, of being honest, not only with others, but also with myself about my own biases and things I need to correct, how to walk respectfully with each other, even when harm is done, which is a very hard thing to do. And you need to have the courage to do that. You need to have the courage to walk a different way than all your colleagues and not do everything the same as it always has been, because change does need to happen. Wisdom comes with lived experience. that's really living through things, sharing our stories, going and seeing for yourself, gathering data to show the truth to yourself, because it's the truth that we really need to see. And what binds that all together is love. Love is really binding these 7 sacred teachings together. And if we walk with these values, and I know everybody knows these values, then we walk from a heart to heart, spirit to spirit level. And that's really where change comes from, whether it's in the engineering profession, whether it's within the country as a whole, whether it's within an individual organization or simply just within your household. Change happens, and every little piece that people make makes a huge difference. And so I want to leave you with this quote. So this comes from the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. Reconciliation is about healing relationships and building trust and working out differences. The phrase forgive and forget is a popular phrase used in reference to reconciliation. However, John Paul Lederich maintains that true reconciliation is not forgive and forget, nor does reconciliation involve remembering, justifying, and repeating. True reconciliation, Lederich states, is to remember and change. And so I want to leave you with that and leave you thinking about these things. I'm always available for a conversation, and I hope you can consider me a safe and brave place to come and ask your questions to. If you have questions around anything that we talk about, it's a lot of content, and we only have a couple minutes here for conversation and dialogue, but I'll turn it back over for moderation. Michael, is that for you?
Sure. To say that gives food for thought is just a bit of an understatement. So actually, I'm going to read this because I think I would struggle with trying to remember my thought as you're giving it. So first of all, I want to thank you for your bravery in sharing your lived experience today. So I knew that I didn't know what I didn't know, but it's kind of humbling, just even more not realizing what we didn't know. So, but realistically, I think it's still really important that we did this today, because we can't, and the whole point of having multiple female engineers speaking during this month is to celebrate and to share and to add chairs around the table. That's how we actually have a richer, more inclusive set of creative solutions to things. It's the only way. And so although today's truth is really, really hard, I think it is such a critical first step to really learning how to share as the family of Canada. I don't know how else I really have to process, to be quite frank, to kind of express it any better than that. So anyway, thank you very, very much for today.
You're welcome. And I do want to end again with that note that this is a lot of content. Maybe it's new content. And again, in this type of forum, I can't see everyone. So if you are feeling triggered or overwhelmed emotionally, please reach out to your wellness supports, what's available in your organization, as well as there are free public supports available around Canada as well.
Jessica, sorry, and again, I will echo Michael's comments. It was obviously difficult to listen to some of the, especially your lived experience. And I think I'm almost embarrassed for myself, at least, is the fact that, like, I think over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of advocacy, a lot of awareness on this topic. And you know, just sort of being sort of a layman, you learn about it, but like really just sort of listening to you, I was just sort of blown back with respect to how much I don't know, how much there's, you know, you're living in, you know, the 21st century in 2023, you're expecting that, you know, these things don't happen, right? Like, or at least that's what it's portrayed, and it's just jarring to see that, you know, like there's a lot of work to do. And your last comment of the reconciliation, it is really remembering and changing, and that definitely got to me. So I wanted to ask you, I think we've been learning, and like, you know, how the Prime Minister has apologized for all that's done. And do you think we're, as within Canada, turning that page over into that frame of changing, or do you think there's still a component of people actually just don't know what they don't know? I don't know what you're like. Are we there almost? I'd like to think we are, but I thought at least we are. But after this presentation, I feel like we're probably not.
So I don't think we're there. I think we do have a long ways to go. I'm going to pop into the chat a report from the Yellowhead Institute. And so they have been tracking the calls to action within Canada. And so the calls to action came out in 2018 with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Something a lot of people don't know about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is that was funded by residential school survivors. That came out of a long fought claim against the federal government. The government didn't willingly fund that commission. And so the survivors went around, gathered testimony, which was hard for anybody who participated, and came up with the 94 calls to action. According to this latest update, we're not going to get there till about 2075. There hasn't been a whole lot of movement in the calls to action. There has been a lot of efforts. Where there has been a lot of efforts is in the education piece of it. I know in our province, the K-12 system did a really good job of integration into curriculum. We did have a change in government, though, that unfortunately took a lot of those changes out of our K-12 curriculum, but hopefully that will be restored at some point. I know universities are making changes. There's been a lot of commission reports towards enforcement, the role of racism within the RCMP, police services, a lot of documentaries around murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls within the health systems. There is still a lot of activity within the government for changes to the Indian Act. There's a open consultation regularly about changes that need to be made. But it's, to me personally, band-aid solutions for larger systematic things that need to happen. So there is a willingness of people to learn. And there's a willingness and an appetite right now for people to support Indigenous businesses and economic reconciliation, and people learning on their own. There's so much content out there for podcasts and books and documentaries around this. People are wanting to hear the truth because you folks, settlers, have also been denied the truth. So you have your own healing to go through to come to terms to that as well. So we are making movement. Will it go as quick as people want? No. In the meantime, we are still sitting with just under 100 boil water advisories, the largest growing population within Canada. So there's still lots to be done. But it starts with hearing the truth and processing that and getting to a point where we're all ready to move forward together. So lots of movement in that learning space, which is really great. So it's coming along.
Great, thank you. I know we're past time. There is one question I was asked in the chat. I think there's a couple of folks sort of thanking you for all of everything really that you're doing. And maybe if you have time for one last question. So it says that the Indian Act in 2023 should just be abolished.
So that's a bit of a complicated question because there is dependency on the Indian Act. So even though there's a lot of oppressive pieces in it, it is the only way that rights are given right now to First Nations people, as well as there has been a Supreme Court decision saying federal government does have responsibility towards Métis as well. So in my personal opinion, there has to be a large transition period from the Indian Act, an oppressive piece of legislation, to progressive legislation. I'm part of a global Indigenous exchange that we do with countries like New Zealand, who already have existing progressive legislation that supports cultural restoration. And so there are examples around the world that Canada can look at and use but it will take a very strong, very motivated political leader of this country in order to do that. And I won't comment on my thoughts on that.
Yeah, that would be, yeah. I think that's a full stop all on its own, and I have to say I would agree, and I'm a white guy, so there you go. It really is sad that we are actually at time now. As normal, we post our recordings on YouTube, and we have one link for further information. There's just so much that I feel that I don't know, and I'm just barely scratching the surface. So I wonder, Jessica, if we could actually work with you to maybe, because I think a lot of us, anyone here, I would think, has more appetite to learn more of what they don't know. So perhaps we could work with you to get some more good kind of self-directed learning links, and then share that with those who are registered.
For sure, most definitely. And I'll do a selfless plug for my own podcast that I co-host, Unsettled Journeys in Truth and Conciliation. If you want to hear more about these things, I'll just pop it in the chat here.
That'd be lovely. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody. And that will close off our webinar for today. Join us next week as we continue our journey in learning from different women in STEM. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, everybody. Bye for now.